Everyone knows the story of Adam and Eve. They were the first humans created by God in the Garden of Eden. Everything was fine until a snake convinced Eve to eat an apple, and then Eve got Adam to eat it too. After that, God kicked them out, and it became a big deal. But there's more to the story. If you read the book of Genesis, you'll notice that God creates the world twice, and the two versions don't completely match. For people who don't take the story literally, like many Christians and Jews, this isn't a big deal. But some biblical scholars, who think Genesis was written as one complete story by Moses, see this as a problem. Over time, people have tried to make the two versions fit together. For example, some suggested that Adam was created as a hermaphrodite, with both male and female parts, since one version says God made Adam and Eve at the same time. This idea was debated but stuck around for a long time. The two creation stories are also where the idea of Lilith comes from in Jewish mythology. She is said to be Adam's first wife, and later became a demon. Lilith is thought to be the woman created in the first version, while Eve was made later from one of Adam's bones. It's also important to remember that when you're reading the Bible in English, you're reading a translation. For instance, the part where it says Eve was made from Adam's rib isn't exactly what the original Hebrew word means. The word sela, which is used there, usually means side, not rib, which leaves a lot of room for different interpretations. And people have certainly done a lot of interpreting over the years. A respected biblical professor suggested that Eve might have been made from Adam's baculum, which is a bone found in the penis of many mammals. Even other primates have this bone, and Dr. Zioni Zevit believes that Genesis might explain why humans don't. If God took a bone from Adam, then his descendants wouldn't have it. Men have an even number of ribs but no baculum, so Dr. Zevit thinks this might be the real bone used to create Eve. This may seem like a small detail, similar to the question of whether Adam and Eve had belly buttons, but it's actually been a huge theological issue for thousands of years. If they had belly buttons, it would suggest they had mothers, which they didn't. But if they didn't have belly buttons, how could they be perfect humans? A book called Did Adam and Eve Have Navels? Explains how serious this debate has been, even leading to a U.S. congressional committee getting involved in 1944 because soldiers were given pamphlets showing Adam and Eve with belly buttons. Artists also struggled with this. Some added leaves to cover the belly buttons, while others drew them with smooth stomachs. Interestingly, the belly button debate got tied into the evolution debate. An 1857 book claimed that Adam and Eve having belly buttons was proof the Earth was only a few thousand years old. Anything older, like fossils, was just like a belly button, a mark of a past that didn't really happen, except in God's mind. If you ask people what fruit Adam and Eve ate that made God angry, most will say it was an apple. But the Bible never actually says what kind of fruit it was. In English, it's just called fruit. The Hebrew word is peri, which is also vague. Different Jewish scholars have interpreted it as a fig, grape, pomegranate, apricot, or even wheat. Some even thought it might have been an intoxicating drink, like wine. So why do we all think it was an apple? It all comes down to a pun. In the 4th century AD, Pope Damasus decided the Bible needed to be translated into Latin. Jerome did the translation and chose to use a pun for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In Latin, malus means both evil and apple, so Jerome made the forbidden fruit an apple. John Milton reinforced this idea in his poem Paradise Lost, where he called the forbidden fruit an apple. Childbirth has always been very painful for women because of the size of human skulls and hips. In the past, men often said women had to suffer during childbirth because Eve's sin made it a punishment from God. Genesis 3:16 says, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you will give birth to children." But as noted by Christianity Today, there's a translation issue. The original word used means labor or toil elsewhere in the Bible, and it was only in the context of childbirth that it was translated to include pain. Throughout history, Religious figures argued that easing childbirth pain was wrong because it would take away from the suffering God intended. For instance, Martin Luther said, "Women should be happy to suffer to bring babies into the world." And a New England pastor once argued that pain relief during childbirth would rob God of hearing women's cries for help. This led to strong reactions when pain medication became available in the 1800s. During the 1800s, scholars learned more about ancient Egyptian civilization, finding very old texts and monuments. This raised a religious problem because if the Bible is taken literally and Adam and Eve were created only a few thousand years ago, how could the Egyptian artifacts be older? The pre-Adamite theory, which started in the 17th century, suggested that people lived before Adam. This theory helped explain where Cain's wife and other cities came from. Some Christians liked this idea because it suggested that some people were descended from those who weren't Adam and Eve, which allowed for arguments that these people were less important. This idea was misused to justify slavery and to claim that some lives were worth more than others. Many people in history believed the Garden of Eden was a real place and tried to find it. Genesis describes it as a place where one river splits into four, which is not much to go on. Even explorers like Christopher Columbus were interested in finding it. He thought he was close when he landed in Hispaniola and even closer in Venezuela. David Livingstone once claimed that the Garden of Eden was at the source of the Nile, though he was suffering from malaria at the time. In 1881, Methodist minister William Warren published a book saying Eden was at the North Pole. In the 20th century, different places like Ohio, Florida, and Mongolia were suggested. Some residents of the Seychelles even hoped to find Eden on their islands. Other theories placed it in Azerbaijan, Armenia, Bahrain, South Carolina, Somalia, or submerged in the Persian Gulf. The most common location proposed has been Iraq, but even there, two sites compete for the title of the real Garden of Eden. Many people assume that all Christians take the Genesis creation story literally and believe Adam and Eve were real people. While some do, this belief is becoming less common in America. A 2017 Gallup poll found that only 38% of American Christians believed God created Adam and Eve as real people about 10,000 years ago. An equal number believed in evolution with God's guidance, and 19% believed in evolution without God's involvement. Protestants are more likely to believe in some version of evolution compared to Catholics. Even evangelicals are moving away from a strict literal interpretation, and many Christian scholars are finding ways to blend faith and science. This approach might actually align with what the original writers of Genesis intended, as many scholars believe it was originally meant as allegory and poetry rather than literal history. The idea of interpreting Genesis literally didn't emerge until St. Augustine began discussing creation in the 4th century AD. Recently, in 2018, some tabloids and less reputable news sources reported a study that supposedly proved the existence of Adam and Eve, although the study's actual findings were more complex. Recent research traced human genetics back and found that all humans share a common ancestry from one couple who lived tens of thousands of years ago. However, this was misreported. The study only looked at mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA, but there's a lot more DNA from other people that contributed to our genetics. The term mitochondrial Eve refers to the most recent common ancestor of all humans through mitochondrial DNA, not the first human woman ever. Many news stories misunderstood this, so researchers had to clarify that they believed in evolution and were not suggesting there was a single couple named Adam and Eve. Scientists estimated that mitochondrial Eve lived between 100,000 and 230,000 years ago, while Y chromosomal Adam likely lived about 75,000 years before her. These two people were not the first humans on Earth. This concept was not new. Similar findings were reported in a 2013 study. The takeaway is that it's crucial to read research carefully to understand the true findings.